Gamshi Lakwan. So, let's continue from where we left off. And where we left off, if you recall, we were talking about the parable of the swimming pool. That is, Romanized Christianity is kind of like a swimming pool. It bleaches you, and it makes you think that everything is correct from a particular perspective, usually European-American axiological perspective, because that's what we're also talking about is axiology. When we look at some of the phenomenon of liberation theology as practiced by Africans in America, then we start looking at returning to roots. So as an example, reclaiming our spiritual practices in their original form or as close to the original form as we can manage. So the concept of liberation theology is that the goal of your religion or your spiritual practice is to free you from any earthly or mental or spiritual chains. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. So we need to reclaim our spiritual practices in their original form or as close to it as we can get. So the Peshitta, that is the Bible in Aramaic, not the King James Version. So Aramaic, that language, not English or Latin. Looking at meditation and breath and reverence for the sacred feminine, reverence for nature, reverence for Allah, which are basically all forms within the Christian religion as was practiced before the Romans hijacked it, essentially. So in African-American writers, for example, like Muada Ashby, in his book, The Mystical Journey from Jesus to Christ, quoted St. Augustine, the Berber. As I pointed out before, St. Augustine was an African. And his quote is, "What is now called the Christian religion has existed among the ancients and was not absent from the beginning of the human race until Christ came in the flesh, from which time the true religion, which is already in existence, began to be called Christian." So what he's saying here is that what is called the Christian religion already existed in many other forms and simply had a particular label slapped upon it, but it was a particular way of viewing the world, which if we were talking about in the what is referred to in English as the Egyptian mystery schools, we'd call this Natarianism. That is, you understand that there is the immanence of a supreme being. There's a supreme intelligence that you are part of that would cause you to not only reverence nature, but reverence your adversaries as well as your allies, instill equality and reverence for not only youth, but also elders. So one of the ways that Africans look at the world is using symbolic imagery and rhythm. So I created, in the spirit of innovation, a construct I call the strings of the kora. Now, the kora is the instrument of choice of the griot. And the griot is, there is no English equivalent for it in our common parlance, but if we were to put a series of characteristics on what a griot is, it's a musician, poet, storyteller, praise song singer, diplomat, and healer. So the kora has 21 strings, 3 sets of 7 each, representing the past, present, and the future. And the way that a kora is played and the way it's tuned is that different strings resonate with each other. And so I'm presenting it here as the overall construct that Ron Karenga created was kawaida. And so we're talking about kawaida and social change. So there are 2 kinds of black people. Now, of course, there are more than 2 kinds of black people, but historically, 2 kinds of black people, that is Kush, Al-Kebulan, and Indus Kush, India. So it is a historical fact that 50,000 years ago, one of the major migrations of Africans out of the African continent occurred into India. And it is a fact that one of the oldest black populations or African populations on the planet today are the Dravidians of India. These are the folks that basically generated many of the world's religions, including Buddhism. But Kush and Indus Kush. So yoga came out of an African context and was transported from Africa through this migration to India, where we know it from today. But the origins are African in origin, and yoga is itself basically talking about the union of opposites, and you saw how that worked in an original Egyptian context with Horus, Horus, also known as Heru, uniting with Set. So the higher self uniting with the lower self. So the opposites can be united because what appears to separate them is not real. So can you see the unity within the duality? And yoga is one of the practices that teaches you how to deal with difficult people as well as difficult aspects of yourself to learn to harmonize them in a greater whole. Okay, so can you see the unity within the duality or not? So as an example, Rudra is one of the names for the Hindu god Shiva, the howling one. And there is you might have seen a set of mala beads. A mala is a meditation aid. The Rudraksha fruit, so for example, is often called the Rudraksha fruit, which is blue here, is often called the tears of Shiva. Shiva is basically in his Nataraj form. That is, in terms of looking at symbolic imagery, he's dancing, he's treading on a demon, which is also symbolic of the ego, and he's basically subduing the ego using his breath and using, you might be not able to see the detail here, but he's basically using his hair and snakes to tether his ego and to tether illusion. And there's various symbolism being used within this particular statue. So he's doing the Nataraj, the dance of life. And he's also, Shiva is also the destroyer. That is, why is Shiva crying? He's destroying the universe, but he's also making way for the universe to be created. So the tears of Shiva, that blue fruit, the Rudraksha fruit. And inside that fruit is a seed, depicted here on the lower right, which is often put together as a meditation aid, as a mala. So why is Shiva crying? He's destroying the universe and also creating the universe. The strings of the Kora are held by Shiva to deconstruct supremacy and recreate equity. So that's why I'm using this as a symbol here. Shiva Nataraj, the dance. The strings of the Kora, Karenga's Kawa Ida construct, most popularly known by the first 7 principles of blackness, which are also the 7 days of Kwanzaa. Umoja, Kujichagulia, Ujima, Ujama, Nia, Kuumba, Imani. And the 7 levels of action: individual, informal group, institution, community, nation, globe. The 7 products of culture: history, psychology, creative arts and science, politics, spirituality, economics, and social organization. So this is these 21 elements are part of Karenga's Kawa Ida construct. The first, which, as I've said before, is most people are familiar with the 7 principles or the 7 days of Kwanzaa, but the actual construct has 21 elements. So I'm posing it as a problem-solving tool. So Shiva is holding those 21 strings. He's dancing on tradition and innovation. So these are 2 influences within African-American culture. That is, you're facing certain life issues, maybe survival issues, and maybe you've never faced them before, so you have to create a solution. That's where the innovation comes from. If the innovation works long enough, it becomes a tradition. But sometimes your traditions don't match or don't solve the new problem, so you have to create something out of nothing and innovate again. So tradition and innovation are two separate strands within African American culture. Now, using the strings of the kora to analyze a particular problem is an expanded view. You can basically pick a problem and look to see if there, for example, is a historical precedent for it. Has anybody ever faced this problem before, and how did they overcome it? So that's why within the construct or the idea of Sankofa, which means go back and fetch it, we go back and learn the history. Or if we're facing a particular problem, how do we face that particular problem, and how do we overcome it, and what elements of culture might we use to craft a solution if no solution has existed before? And what level can we apply that? Can we apply that as individuals? And can we apply that on a global structure? So, starting with the Nguzo Saba, which is Kiswahili for the 7 principles of blackness. 7 principles of blackness, starting with the first, umoja, unity. Basically, the idea that all Africans planet-wide are one people. Indeed, all people planet-wide are ultimately Africans, but certainly all people within not only the continent of Africa, but also the Caribbean, the West Indies, North, Central, and South America, India, Australia, they're all one people. So, umoja means unity in Kiswahili. Umoja also means peace in Kiswahili, because you cannot have peace without unity. Kujichagulia, self-determination, defining for yourself who you are and where you're going. So yesterday when I talked about being an African American, what that meant. We're not descendants of slaves. My self-determination allows me to say, we are not descendants of slaves, we are descendants of traders, scientists, and activists. And we've been here for 2,500 years, not since slavery. So when we came here as a free people to trade with the natives, the indigenous people of Turtle Island in 850 BC. At least in 850 BC, which is the 25th dynasty of Egypt. So that shifts the frame in terms of self-determination. So in order to remain free, I have to be cognizant of that history and act as if I am the descendant of people who are diplomats and scientists rather than slaves and or criminals. Self-determination. Ujima, collective work and responsibility. To make our brothers and sisters' problems our problems, to solve and assist them in solving them. Cooperative economics, also known as African socialism. And how African socialism works is very similar to what Native American traditional socialism is. That is, if Creator created the land, no person can own it. We don't believe in real estate because no human being created the earth. But the earth is available for you to use productively to grow food. And when you do that, you grow enough food at least for your family, and if you have a surplus, then you give that surplus away, particularly to people who don't have it. So we don't believe in poor people either. It's sort of like, if you're a parent and you have children, which of your children do you not feed? Which of your family do you not give good things or nourishment from? So cooperative economics is based on 3 principles. Ujamaa, as articulated by Julius Nyerere, a Tanzanian economist. Basically 3 constructs. First, Ujama. Spiritualism. Your economics are generated by your spirituality. Second, your economics are anti-racist and anti-sexist. So when Nyerere is talking about these things making up African spirituality, are also African socialism, this is different from what's being articulated by European Karl Marx. Karl Marx definitely had some racist suppositions within his construct that he didn't necessarily question, and when black socialists, even within England, basically questioned some of his stuff, he would put them down using basically racist ethnic slurs instead of countering their arguments with logic. So, Ujamaa, African socialism, spirituality, anti-racist, anti-sexist, and coming up with solutions so that, no, we don't have real estate because you can't own something you didn't create. When you do create something, then you own that and you can use that within your economic system. Nia, purpose. What is your purpose? What is your individual life purpose? What is the purpose of your people? What are your goals? How do they fit your life purpose, your life mission? Kuumba, creativity, and Imani, faith. Now, when these are translated into the African American holiday of Kwanzaa, Kwanzaa is not a black Christmas. Kwanzaa is basically a time set within the mainstream context of Christmas, starting the day after Christmas and going to New Year's, so 7 days. You basically are, the idea is to essentially celebrate African and African American healthy culture in a particular time of the year, but also looking at doing it all year and recognizing that these elements are operating throughout our culture. The 7 levels and the 7 products. So 7 levels of social interaction, starting with the individual, informal group, organizational, institutional, community, societal, and global levels. And then the 7 products of culture: history, psychology, spirituality and religion, politics, creative production, arts and sciences, economics, and social organization. So let's pick a problem. So you'll notice one of the, in the lower left-hand corner, the I am. This was generated in, we'll be referring to this model much later when we get to the 90s, but the I am is the Institute for African American Mobilization. It was a culturally specific workshop created using your tax dollars to basically counter the just say no lies and basically say, okay, African Americans can create their own responses to addiction using healthy aspects of African culture. And so I was part of the team that helped put this together, and one of the things we decided to use was Karenga's Kawaida construct as a problem solving. So we had just been talking about drug dealing gangs. So one of the questions in dealing with drug dealing gangs and the history of drug dealing gangs is, how did the gangs who didn't have guns and didn't have access, didn't speak Spanish, how did they get access to crack cocaine? What were the global conditions that allowed that to occur, that facilitated that? So taking out of the equation intervention by intelligence services. And let's just look at drug dealing gangs and drug producers on the illegal side of the economy. So there's an above ground economy and there's a below underground economy. And the underground economy, of course, operates in tandem with the above ground economy. So how is it that black youth with no weapons who don't speak Spanish suddenly have access to crack cocaine? Well, let's start with cocaine itself. So, DARE. Drugs are really expensive. So here's how it works. You have 1,000 pounds of coca leaf to make a pound of cocaine. So coca production was fairly steady, and it was usually in the countries of, in the Andes, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, where coca was grown. And it was, relatively limited. It was grown basically for medical use and also for illegal use for the better part of 2 centuries. Because remember, we talked about drug dealing gangs being around for about 170 years. So they weren't necessarily dealing with cocaine 170 years ago because cocaine was a legal drug then. But when it was made illegal, except for certain medical uses after 1914, certain part of the market was basically producing pharmaceutical cocaine, and a certain part of the market was also producing illegal cocaine for the illegal market. So one of the things that happened is it took X amount of years, say 6 years, to produce a mature coca crop. And a lowland variety of coca was produced by the Colombians, who heretofore, at the point that we're talking about, late 70s, early 80s, had been in the distribution end, not in the manufacturing or growing end. They developed a lowland, so instead of the high Andes, the mountainous regions where in Peru and Bolivia, etc., they found a lowland growing version that they could basically grow. And so all of a sudden now in the early 80s, you have a glut of cocaine. So usually, because how capitalism works is by supply and demand, you would expect that a flood or a glut of cocaine would drop the price. Not so. What happened was an innovation, basically taking this powdered cocaine, so 1,000 pound of coca leaf, add sulfuric acid, kerosene, a bunch of other chemicals. You get coca paste, which basically translates 1-to-1 into coca base or coca powder. So then, which can be either snorted, injected, and smoked. But one of the old methods of smoking cocaine basically started with an ounce of cocaine and involved ether, which is an explosive chemical. So sometimes if you would apply a torch, so basically you need to be able to buy an ounce of cocaine, which is fairly expensive to do that. So basically rock stars, movie stars, and then basically you would treat your cocaine with ether, and the mixture would be explosive. So we call this, I would call this the Richard Pryor effect, because this would happen with Richard Pryor. His coke pipe exploded, and he was running down the street outside of his house on fire. Not terribly funny, but somewhat ironic. So another form was basically crack, which instead of using ether, basically people use baking soda and water, boiling the cocaine, and then the cocaine would basically clump into rocks, and essentially what you get was, you start with an ounce of cocaine, which is 28.35 grams. All right, so you basically spend, say, $3,000 an ounce. So about $100 a gram, roughly. Right? So 1 gram could basically generate 10 to 15 crack rocks, which then you sell at anywhere between 20 to 40 plus dollars per rock, depending on your market, and you make tons of money. But first you have to get the cocaine to a market, and then you have to create a market. So what happens then is the mafia had gotten out of the drug game, and so here you have, if you go back to slide, if you would, on the global level, you have a glut of cocaine on the world market, and you need a distribution system. So what you need is drug dealing gangs, and create drug dealing gangs where they didn't exist before. Well, how would you do that? Basically, if you create the conditions that in a community which create drug dealing gangs, so drug dealing gangs become an informal group, and these folks then can get supplied by the underground economy with both guns and cocaine, and then spread that throughout their underground institutions, throughout society as well as the globe. And so so when you look at how we're going to counter this, so there's economics involved, especially if, so for example, as was said at a recent gang conference, Hewlett-Packard is not hiring, but the Bloods are, right? In terms of dealing illegal drugs and basically finding a ready market for the drug habits of America. So one of the ways that you would counter that is by looking at the 7 levels of social interaction and the things that support the formation of drug dealing gangs, and you look at the history of that. History to a people is like memory to a person, so if you want to change the thinking of a person, you have to essentially change their understanding of history by adding a corrected version of history that's still accurate, and that changes their thinking, and that also could begin to change how they relate with others, which could be their spirituality, how they deal with power, their politics, and then how you support and express that spirituality, psychology, and politics in creative production, either arts or music, or in terms of looking at other sciences and using those economic. So economics are basically the study of and science of the trade of that which is valuable. So it's not just material goods, it's also wisdom and education. And social organization basically deals with how individuals join and form informal groups, which then become organizations, and then institutions, which then become parts of communities, contribute to society, and then to the globe. So within this particular construct of kawaida, then we can see if we're going to intervene at particular levels, we need to be able to look at the history of an organization and how it sees itself and where it's going, and look at particular modes of solving problems. So teaching people to have skill with the various levels of culture, as well as operating on various levels of social interaction. The president might refer to it, for example, as social mobility. One of the things that confers social mobility is education. So particular form and type of education. So tradition and innovation. The tradition is the global, historical, spiritual, and political analysis that is peculiar to Africans in America, and Africans in general, but Africans in America. So that's part of our tradition, is we look from a global perspective and also a historical perspective, and then use spirit and politics to problem solve. So the innovation, then, is how you apply a solution to current problems by analyzing how current problems came to be and looking at past, present, and future solutions. So when we were looking at memetics, for example, as applied to gangs, we basically were able to say, okay, the gangs have certain goals. We could have them and teach them to meet those goals using pro-social means if we give them the right history, give them the right understanding of psychology, politics, etc. So, symbolic imagery and rhythm, which is African epistemology according to Nichols. So here's how that works. So, logical sense. You have here a square and a circle inside the square. So, logic is a mentally constructed means of reasoning to an answer. Sense. So, logical sense is what the square is covering up. Logical sense. Sense is conforming to what your 5 physical senses tell you. What you can see, what you can touch, what you can hear, what you can taste, what you can smell. So, logic should square with sense. But it often doesn't. Logic can unfold. So we can move from square to a cube, to a hypercube, to a multidimensional hypercube. So logic unfolds in a particular way. All right? When logic doesn't square with sense, one of 2 things is happening, and I suggest you check for them in this order. A limited purpose is using logic to lie. So check for the truth. Be aware of the lie. A higher purpose is causing logic to unfold in a different direction than you are used to. Here's how that works. So we were talking the other day about the logic of the Constitution. All men are created equal. But all people are not men. So within the Constitution, the statement that all men are created equal, and somebody might interpret that in a literal English sense as that means all people, using the general pronoun men to stand in for all people like we do mankind, or if we use the politically correct humankind. But historically, we know this is not the case. Jefferson et al. Were not really capable of thinking of their black slaves as human beings because their economic system actually favored them not thinking about them as human beings. Right? So within the Constitution, a limited purpose is using logic to lie. All men are not created equal. Women are less than men within the Constitution. Non-whites are inferior to whites, as defined in the Constitution. All men are not created equal. A higher purpose is causing logic to unfold in a different direction than you're used to. So, if a limited purpose is using logic to lie, as in the Constitution, that is, enshrining inequity and discrimination. So if you're going to fight or struggle for civil rights equality, you're going to have to use a different logic system and apply that in a way that will actually look crazy to the people that benefit from the inequity. In fact, you'll be considered crazy initially. So logic unfolds. So either lies or growth can cause confusion unless you retain a sense of connection to what is real and true. So on the far right, you have a square. Actually, let's start with the left. You have a square. You square the square, you have a cube. So in effect, 6 squares put together. And then you square the cube and you get a hypercube. And then you square that and you get a multidimensional hypercube. Now, one of the things that I use this hypercube to illustrate is how your world or your perception of your world is shaped. So in Kujichagulia, you want to learn how to shape your world yourself. So often how that works is that you exist within in a 3-dimensional cube. So first of all, a square is 2 dimensions, length and width. A cube is 3 dimensions, length, width, and depth. This 4-dimensional hypercube, which is that graphic, that's black, basically is a 4-dimensional hypercube, and the 4th dimension could be time in any conception that you want to look at time. So adding the dimension of time to the 3 dimensions of space, you come up with a construct of space-time. So there are lots of different ways of conceiving how you're moving through space-time. You can look at it in a linear fashion, you can look at it in a spiral fashion, you can look at it in a multidimensional simultaneous fashion, you can look at it from a quantum physics fashion in which, in quantum physics, past, present, and future are actually illusions. They're confused. You don't necessarily have linear time. That's an illusion that you use to make sense of the world, but until you can expand your vision to encompass other possibilities, parallel universes, and basically in a multiplex dimensional universe. So that's basically symbolized by the multidimensional hypercube to the right, where a person is actually part of a multidimensional web of forces, not just space-time, but also energy, electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear forces, quantum forces within the atom. All those are affected by the human being and affect the human being. So how do you retain a sense of connection to what is real and true depends on, first, your point of view, and also what you are used to in terms of constructing your reality. Does the past affect the future? Can you see how the past affects the now? And can you see how the now will affect the future? This is happening in a multi-dimensional context that may not be necessarily seen from a point of view of a person who's only oriented to seeing the now or what has been told to them or constructed. So, the African self. Let's say the 5-fold African self can be experienced in at least 12 ways. So here's how that works. This is a conception of how Africans construct the world in terms of looking at our ego structure, from our point of view in terms of our psychology. So let's say that it can be experienced in at least 12 ways. So let's say that human beings in particular, and I'm using the constructs that came out of Egypt, transferred to India and globally across the world, generated by Africans, how that applies to psychology. So you take the 5 senses: sight, touch, taste, hearing, smell. 5 physical senses, and you add to them the input from the 7 spheres of Ra, or the 7 chakras. Survival, creativity, power, the heart, speaking the truth, seeing, visioning, and connection to the universe. 7 chakras. You can think of them as levels of thought. So the 5-fold African self can be experienced in at least 12 ways, one for each of those senses. So this symbology here, the African self developed by Naim Akbar. The African ego is experienced at least 5 ways: a soul level, a body physical level, a mind personal level, which includes your emotions, a social relational level, and a tribal ancestral level. So each one of those can be experienced in at least 12 ways. So let's say the African self projected on this figure, which is the crystal figure behind this graphic, the African self graphic, is a dodecahedron. A dodecahedron has 12 faces, and each of those 12 faces is a pentagon. Okay, so how would the African self be experienced on a survival level? The first chakra. How would the African self be experienced on a creative level? How would it be experienced on a power level? How would it be experienced on the level of compassion? How would it be experienced in truth-telling? How would it be experienced in wisdom generation, seeing clearly, seeing visioning through the third eye point? How would it be experienced through the 7th chakra? Right? So the fivefold African self can be experienced in at least 12 ways. Okay, so 5 physical senses, 7 spiritual ones. So whether you think of it, 7 steps to heaven that is within you and among your community. So the kingdom of heaven, as Yeshua talked about, is the word that the words in Aramaic that are used for the kingdom of heaven is within. It's not only within, but it's not only within you, but it's also among your community. The same word means the same thing, both in Hebrew and Aramaic. Same preposition, within you and among your people. So what I'm saying is each chakra can be personally experienced 5 different ways in terms of your spiritual level, the body, the mind, your social, and tribal. So 12 senses. So what I'm talking about in terms of looking at African thought is that we can't just look at the present situation that we're in. We also have to understand that this present situation was caused historically and could also be experienced in the future in a completely different way. So often we will speak in multi-level parables, multi-dimensional parables. So for example, Derek Bell wrote in 2 of his different books about the parable of the space traders, and actually I will give you, if you actually Google on YouTube, there is a YouTube movie featuring George Clinton talking about the space traders, and what happens is Derek writes this as a parable, and what he's talking about within the parable is what would happen if space aliens came to Earth and asked for, basically offered to give America in particular technology that they have unlimited energy, all the gold that they want, clean up the environment, and technologies to do all those things, and the only thing that the aliens want in return is the entire black population of the United States. That's the premise of the Space Traders. Great half-hour movie. So as part of the chapter in Derek's book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, and also as a chapter in his book, Gospel Choirs, the Space Traders, he's a constitutional scholar, so he basically talks about how in 3 weeks, the United States actually makes a constitutional amendment that drafts the entire black population and sends them in chains onto the space alien ships where they're taken away on Martin Luther King's birthday. Now, today, as I record this, this is the anniversary of Martin Luther King's death. So I think it's actually particularly apt that we talk about this today. Would America make that deal if the space traders actually came? Derek says, yes, they would. Without hesitation. They find a way to do it. So what is he talking about within that parable? Well, you have to read the story or see the video or also read the book, because it's not so much that, yes, we got sent off into slavery again. It's also what happens when the space traders take us away and we're leaving Earth. The chains come off, and the space traders explain why they wanted us. And why they wanted us was because of our ability to endure oppression and still maintain our spirituality. They are technologically advanced, but they've lost a quality of soul which they see African Americans as having. And they want it. And they figure the only way that they can get it is by getting us away from America. Now, Derek also has a couple of other books where he talks about a continent called Afro-Atlantica, which rises in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And it is found out when people try to explore this new land that only African Americans can stand to live there. And so finally we have a place that we can live in freedom in America, and then it disappears beneath the waves, and then it reappears. And so he talks about that in his book, Afro-Atlantica Legacies. So the idea behind that and all the 12 senses, all right? How can you conceive and imagine a response to oppression? What senses do you need to do to be able to endure oppression and craft a response to it? So in symbolic imagery, that's how we're doing that. So if you look at this image, go to slide if you would. If you notice where 3 pentagons come together, where the camera sights along, you can see a hidden structure. Okay, if you notice that. So understand, this is that same dodecahedron. 12 faces of 12 pentagons. Now looking at the vertex of 3 of those pentagons, if you look straight on, do you see a cube in the middle? A hidden structure. Okay, so where 3 pentagons come together, you can see a hidden structure. Now, is that structure actually there? Or is it an illusion? Just ponder that for a second. Is it actually there, or is it an illusion? The reason I ask this is the capacity to see hidden structures of discrimination is like a yogic power. All right? If you practice certain forms of yoga, the classical texts say that you will develop what are called siddhis. Siddhis are what are seen from a particular point as yogic powers or magical powers, but they're not really magical. They're just simply a human capability. Because yoga was designed for human beings, and every human being can basically use those particular capabilities. Since yoga was developed before the major religions exist, it's basically beyond religions and also supportive of them, because it's basically about developing liberation. One of the siddhis, if you will, that is spelled Siddhi, it's a Sanskrit word, it means a yogic power, is the ability to see things that are hidden and treat them as if they are real or a different level of reality. So for example, your cell phones run on quantum physics, but you can't see the quantum signal, but it is there. You can't see the electricity or the electromagnetic fields that are suffusing this room, or your life if you're carrying a cell phone. whether you're carrying a cell phone or not. You don't see the invisible energy flux, but it is there, and it does have an effect on you. Right? So there's a hidden structure. So let's say this hidden structure is racism or systemic discrimination. Is it there or is it not? Well, it's there. You perceive that it's there. So for you, it's there. Just like I was saying the other day, women experience PMS. Is that real or not? Just because men don't experience that reality, is it real or is it not? Well, it's real. It's real if you can perceive it. All right, so within tradition and innovation, the tradition is the global, historical, spiritual, and political analysis. The innovation is how you apply a solution to current problems by analyzing how current problems came to be and looking at past, present, and future solutions. The logic and sense piece. So let's skip. Somehow this is being repeated. Here we go. So, how to live. Paul Robeson gives us an idea. The man who accepts Western values absolutely finds his creative faculties becoming so warped and stunted that he is almost completely dependent on external satisfactions, and the moment he becomes frustrated in his search for these, he begins to develop neurotic symptoms, to feel that life is not worth living, and in chronic cases, to take his own life. Okay, so not Western values, but African values, deeper values than Western civilization might allow you to live. And Alice Walker. I think it pisses God off if you walk by the color purple in a field somewhere and people don't notice it. People think pleasing God is all God care about. But any fool living in the world can see it is always trying to please us back. So there's a relationship there between us and the world. Do you see the hidden structure of beauty? See the hidden structures of oppression? Or not? So a question of slavery or neo-maroonage. So slavery was the condition. We were continually reminded we were brought to America in. Some black folk even thank God that their ancestors got on the slave ship. Using the principle of Kuji-Chagalia, you've seen that part of the intent of this class is to redefine that. No, we're not. Yes, we might be descendant of slaves, but no, that's not all we are. And by the way, slavery was basically an economic condition that you are forced to work for somebody else for free. And the only reason you do that is because they'll kill you if you don't, and you'd rather be alive, even if you are being oppressed. Because sometime if you are alive, you still have, as long as you're alive, that leads to the possibility that you can be free. So the line goes that America offers all that we could ever aspire to, driving Escalades laden with bling bling, chilling with our hoes and our homies. That's a slave mentality. So I guess the connection between slavery and prostitution hasn't been drawn. So the best that you can be is a modern day slaver. Now I'm referring to essentially my conviction as a drug counselor, dealing with people who have gotten out of drug dealing gangs, prostitution, the sex industry. There's nothing proud about being a pimp. A pimp is essentially a slaver. A drug dealer is essentially a slaver. You are addicting people to a thing that makes them a slave to you. So you're making money. You're a slaver. Wait, your people were brought here in chains and you're being like the slavers? How is that an improvement? Okay? America offers all that we could ever aspire to. Pimps and hoes and Escalades. Yeah. Okay? A drug dealer is a slaver of a different kind.